What's up guys, Dr. D here with another video. Today we're going to be doing session setup of a Pro Tools session. Okay, let's get into it. So just looking at the session, we've got all these different tracks. It looks like kick B52. So the instrument, I've got the microphone that was used to record this instrument in each of the names and what instrument that is. Bass guitar direct in. We've got a vocal track. We've got piano left and right, guitar, 2 acoustic guitar tracks, and then the talkback. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here is kind of change maybe some of the names of these tracks to make them easier to read. So one thing I might do is instead of having this kick B52 and all this kind of stuff, I'm going to simplify the names. So, you know, if the kick beater sound is the 52A mic, the Shure SM52A mic, I'm just going to use kick B and just simplify that. Okay, so I'm going to go through all the tracks here and simplify those names. Okay, cool. One of the things I want to do first off is I'd like to create some tracks. And what some tracks are is basically an stereo auxiliary input track that I'm going to route all of the like instruments through so I can control it with one fader. On a Mac, I'm going to use Command-Shift-N. And as I'm doing this, I kind of want to think, how many different groups of instruments do I have? Okay, so I've got the drum kit, all right? I've got bass, I've got guitars, I've got voices, and I have piano. So right there's 5 groups of instruments that I have. And I'm also going to probably think ahead and think I want to use effects return tracks as well. Like I might want to use some reverb, maybe some delay. And the way at which we're going to add reverb and delay and other effects kind of similar to that is to have basically parallel tracks, like one that has just voice on it and one that has voice with reverb. One of the ways to save CPU power is to have like 3 different types of reverbs on return tracks, and then you can send portions of all the different instrument signals through that, and it sounds like everything's in the same room. So in addition to my drums, bass, piano, guitar, and voice some tracks, which will all be created using a stereo auxiliary input track in Pro Tools, I'm going to create maybe 3 more tracks for my effects. All right. In addition to that, I like to create a mix bus track, which basically is a almost like a master fader. In 9, I can hold down Command and use left or right to go between stereo or mono. I want stereo, and then Command, holding down Command and with up and down, I can switch to an auxiliary input. So I've got 9 stereo auxiliary input tracks I'm going to create here. Go ahead and hit enter, and boom, there they are. I'm going to put these near the end of my session, so while they're selected, I'm going to move them over here to the back side. Do a little house cleaning. I don't need my talkback mic anymore. I'm going to hide and make that inactive. You can right click on a track and you get these options when you click on the nameplate like that, right click. You can, you know, duplicate, rename, hide, make inactive, or make inactive again, or anyway, those options right there. So I'm going to go through and name each of these for their purpose. So right clicking or double clicking on that, auxiliary 1 track, I'm going to call that the drum sum, because I'm summing together all the drum sounds. Then I have the bass sum, and on to guitar, use GTR sum. Then there was the piano sum. Uh-oh, spelling. Okay, piano sum, voice, Vox for short, sum. Okay, all right, so now I'm on to, okay, cool. So now we're going to be on to effects. So how about a long verb? So a long, dark sounding reverb. In addition to a long, dark sounding reverb, I might want a short, bright sounding reverb. So I'm going to go with a short verb. Return there. Let's see, got 2 more. What else was there? Maybe a delay track. There we go. A little bit of tape delay or something like that might be kind of cool. And then I have my mix bus, which is basically the final routing of everything all these individual tracks, all these auxiliary input tracks that are effects or sums or something, that's going to be the final place the signal passes through before it goes on to the master fader right here, okay, out of the speakers. So that's going to be my my submix. Yeah, I was calling it, yeah, submix, not mix bus, submix. Okay, cool. So I've got my submix as well. Now I want to color code these so I can tell them apart. My effects, which are the verbs and the delay, I'm going to select those, holding down, you know, shift and clicking on the nameplate. You can select multiples of those. And I'm going to change the color bar by double clicking on it and make that, I don't know, how about blue? Okay. Then I have my 5 sum tracks. I'll leave those as green there. And then my submix, I'm going to change that to a different color too. It's going to be red, bright red, or orangish red. Okay, so I can tell those apart. Acoustic guitars are different colors. The guitar, electric guitar, I have my own color schemes here, so I'm going to adopt those. I like to use the guitars as a greenish color, different hues. So there's my bar guitar. That's kind of like my lead electric guitar. My vocal tracks are always pink. Pianos, yeah, orange works. Bass, I'm going to go purple with bass. Force of habit. This is just my little scheme. And then I have the drums as all blues. Alrighty, so next up, routing. So the way that I'm going to route signal here, here's the theory of routing in a recording, in a mix session. Basically, all the instruments are on individual tracks. Okay, those things are going to sprinkle down, and then I'm going to group them together in groups of instruments. So all the drums, bass, guitar, blah, blah, blah. So they're kind of filtered into these, you know, it's almost like it's raining on a mountaintop, and as the rain pours down onto the mountain, it kind of comes together in little streams, and then those little streams feed into bigger rivers, and then eventually those rivers dump into the ocean. And that's kind of what's going on with the sound. All these individual tracks are matriculating down the mountain, and then they'll come together in bigger streams, which is kind of like the sums, the groups of instruments. And then those sums and groups of instruments, as well as the effects that I have in parallel, those are going to feed eventually into the submix, and then out of the submix into the ocean, which is the master coming out of the speakers left and right. So that's the analogy. Anywho, to make that happen, I need to use sends and use buses, stereo buses, to route out of each of the groups of instruments into the sums, and then the sums will route into the submix. In addition to that, I'm going to use sends with buses as well to route into the effects returns. So let's start with the bottom. Let's work backwards. So all of the signal is going to pass through the submix and through the master fader. Okay. So if I look at my submix track, I/O right here, this marks where the inputs and the outputs are on each of these individual tracks. So the output's going to the master fader through the outputs of the interface, great. But I also need to have some sort of feed into the submix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the bus selection here. I'm going to choose bus 1 and 2. Okay, that is how signal's getting fed into the input of this, which means it needs to be fed from somewhere. So where is it coming from? It's going to come from the sums, the different groups of instruments, and then as well as the effects return tracks. So the outputs of everything from the drum sum through the Vox sum through the 3 effects returns, all of those need to be sent into the submix, because that's kind of like how it makes its way into the river out into the ocean. So I've selected those whatever tracks by holding down shift and clicking. Now I'm going to use option shift. While holding down option shift, I'm going to go to the output of one of these, and I'm going to choose bus 1 and 2. So that means now the output of bus 1 and 2 is being fed into the input of the submix, and that's how signal is getting out. Now, here's the tricky thing. These buses are named with numbers. Really isn't relevant what number it is. Honestly, it'd help me better if it said something like mix bus. It's the bus for all the final mixes, outputs, or whatever. So I use that term mix bus. It's just a term someone taught me and I use now. So I'm going to right click on that bus 1 and 2, rename that mix bus. Okay, buses are buses. I'm going to use the word bus as the Y. It's basically what they call that the method of connecting signal from one place to another place. So now I need to feed all of these individual sum tracks that are auxiliary input stereo tracks, these 4, 5. I need to feed those from the groups of instruments. I need to route from the outputs of each of these instrument tracks into the sum tracks next. So I've got all the kick, all the drum set instruments selected. I'm going to hold down Option Shift. I'm going to go to the output of these drums, and I'm going to route these to the bus 3 and 4. Okay. Bus 3 and 4, that's the output of all the drums. Now those are going to be fed into the input of the drum sum. So now I need to match the drum sum input with bus 3 and 4. Okay, so as to not confuse things, now I'm going to rename bus 3 and 4 by right-clicking on it. I'm going to rename that the drum bus, because it's a bus. It's a way of connecting the signal from one place to another, like the virtual wire. It's called a bus, and it's the bus for the drums. Now all the outputs of the drums are fed into the input of the drum sum, auxiliary input track, which then feeds that signal out into the submix track and then out. So that's kind of the water flowing down the mountain into the rivers, into the streams, into the ocean, right? Okay, cool. Now, let's see what else we got. We got bass. I only have one bass, so I'm just going to create from the output. I'm going to choose bus 5 and 6. They have to be stereo outputs because they're going into a stereo auxiliary input track. So bus 5 and 6, let's rename that the bass bus, and then connect that with the input of the bass sum. Okay, cool. All right, that's the bass. We got guitars here. I'm going to move the guitars up a little bit, put those in front of the piano. Cool. Everything should now be routed instrument-wise. All right, cool. So one way to check this is to hit solo on maybe the acoustic guitar and hit play. All right, so here's what's happening. If I go ahead and I unsolo it, I hear music and I see signal. But when I hit solo, no signal, no music. Here's what's going on. When you solo something in your session, everything else is muted. Even your auxiliary input tracks, which are the sums and the effects returns. That means the signal is basically breaking down when it's sent out of here into the sum track. So what we do to get around that is what's called solo safing. So if I hold down Command and I click on the solo buttons of all of my auxiliary input tracks for effects and for sums and my submix, that's going to bypass the solo functionality. When you solo something, everything else is muted. But now everything's muted except for the sum tracks and the return tracks, which will now allow me to hear signal coming out of the submix and then out of my session. So that's a really important step there. I have to solo safe anything that's going to be used as a sum track or a effects return. The way that you do audio effects like reverb and delay and stuff is not to just put a plugin directly on that instrument, but to create a effects track, an effects return track that I can send a portion of the signal through in addition to the raw signal in the original track, and then bring up reverb and to taste alongside the original vocal track or whatever. Every single instrument here I essentially want to be able to use reverb on or delay. I want all those options. So I'm going to select everything from the sum tracks through all the individual instrument tracks, all of them. Selected all that, shift click, hold down Option Shift, and I'm going to go to my first sends category. I'm going to use the next available bus, and that bus is going to be called long verb. So bus 13, 14, call it long bus actually, because it's a bus, long verb bus, but long bus works okay. Over here on the long verb input, I'm going to match that with the long bus. All right, so the reason I did all of this routing and setup was so that I can now easily have all the tools available to mix with. With the sends, if I want to put reverb on like the vocal track, what I'll do is on the long verb return track here, I'm going to put a plugin, a reverb plugin of some sort, and maybe go with some preset that is something hall reverb. Make sure that the wet and dry needs to be 100%. I need the whole reverb plugin all the way open on, because what I do is I go to something like the vocal track here, I solo it, and I expand the send fader view, which you can do by holding down Command and clicking on the left side, and that expands the fader view of that bus. And this is how I send signal through the reverb. Okay, so if I solo that, I add reverb to taste by bringing up the amount on that send, on that bus that ships it into the long verb. Rocket Man. Okay, so another thing in session setup that's really important to do is to group some of these tracks. Groupings are nice because when you create groups, you can basically, I'll show you what they can do, but you can like manipulate all the faders all at once with one spot, or you can remove all the drums from your session, all the drum tracks out of the session, just focus on like guitars and basses and everything like that. So it's a way of kind of like, you know, micromanaging and organizing things. So let me demonstrate how to do that. So I select all of the drum tracks, for instance, and I can use Command G, which is to create a group box, which is up under track if you want to find it there. But this group is named Group 1 right now. I'm going to call it the drum. Let's call it drums. That's the group name. And then it has currently, since I selected all the drum tracks already, it has all of the drums in the current group. All right, cool. So now I have this drum group selected. Now what happens when I select a group, I can move all the faders simultaneously, right? So whatever I do to one track, it happens to all the tracks at the same time. If I want to solo it, mute it, whatever. Also, I can right click down here in the groups box, which if you don't see it, sometimes it's buried. There's a little arrow thing at the bottom of the Pro Tools window. You can see that little arrow out bar that will show and hide your track list and your group list. It's the same thing over here. We have clips list that shows all the audio files that are sitting in our audio files folder. I can hide that by finding that little box, that little arrow at the bottom. Anyway, back to the group list. I can also hide these drum tracks. If I already mixed drums and I'm all done mixing drums and I don't need to mess with them anymore, I can right click on that group there and I can show, or I can choose to hide tracks in group. Okay, and it's not that they disappear, the drums are still going to play, but the deal is I don't see the drums anymore because I'm not mixing them. You know, after a while in a big session, you might have 20, 30 tracks going all the way across your screen here. You can hide the stuff that you're not using and just mix the instruments, or just mix the drums or the vocals or the orchestra or whatever you have. To make that come back, you right click and choose to show tracks and group, and then my drums are back. Okay, so groups, I'm going to do that for all the different groups of instruments. Okay, another thing that's really important to do before we're done with our mix setup here is to make sure that you have organized the sections of the song. As you do editing and go in here and start working on post-production work, you're going to be paging back and forth through different parts of the song, and it's really important to create song markers here. You kind of find the different parts of the song. When you come to a part of the song like the beginning of the first verse or the second verse or whatever, you put your cursor there, your little insertion point, and then you can click on the markers lane here, click on the plus, and you can name that whatever you want it to be. And it's like the second half of the verse. If I want to snap stuff to a grid, I can turn on the grid mode. You can enable this right here. We didn't record this with a click, so this doesn't work for this project, but I can show and hide the grid, and I can also change the duration of the grid marker. Maybe it's bars, maybe it's half notes, quarter notes. I can basically establish a grid there, and I can snap to a grid if I want to use the snap to grid functionality to where the cursor, the cursor snaps is to turn on grid. So I clicked on grid until it was blue and said grid. Now wherever my cursor goes, it's basically snapping into the grid. the grid lines. And those can be set to be eighth notes, quarter notes, bars, whatever you want them to show up as. So you can enable that or disable that by going between grid and slip mode there. That's kind of what I wanted to cover today. Now the next thing we would do with this session is start tearing into it and doing effects processing and balancing, leveling things out. All right, cool. Hopefully this was helpful. We'll see you in the next video. Peace.